Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming along to my presentation. Today, we'll be discussing the dissemination of audiovisual material involving human remains. Audiovisual material of human remains form a routine component of forensic case documentation and reporting. They allow for the viewer to perceive the remains and are necessary to visually document the interpretation of the expert. The forensic community emphasizes that taking and sharing images of human remains without valid reasoning is not recommended. It is possible for these photographs, videos, or audiovisual material to be replicated, displayed, and occasionally they filter into the public domain without justification or limits, if presented with the opportunity. Such dissemination could remove the deceased person from their context, dehumanize them, and be detrimental to current forensic and humanitarian activities. So today I'll also go through the legal aspect of this, some codes of ethics, and the humanitarian sector. I'd also like to clarify that this includes forensic anthropology, forensic archaeology, forensic odontology, and forensic pathology. So jumping straight into the legal, there is still debate whether the deceased have legal rights posthumously. This is because every country has a different legal system or a different set of laws. So it's really dependent on which area of the world you're in and what actually applies at the time. So some countries specifically state that consent is required from the relatives or a nominated individual to photograph or reproduce images of the deceased. This is in Switzerland and Argentina. In Switzerland specifically, the deceased may not have rights per se, but the Swiss legal system recognizes that due to the sense of kinship of the surviving loved one / the family of the deceased, one cannot display images of human remains without the consent of the surviving loved ones. This is more an emphasis on someone's remains as they're not for a part of the deceased personality rights, but they're a part of the surviving loved one's personality rights. Alternatively, the unlawful sharing of images of the deceased can result in legal repercussions. In Denmark, this is either a fine or up to 6 months jail time. And in France, the family can seek legal action if the remains of their loved one have been shared without consent. Or like images of the remains have been put on display or shared. There are other countries that generically provide posthumous protection of information of the deceased or the prevention of harm to the deceased. And this is in Belgium, China, and Uganda specifically. Even though some legal rights may not apply to human remains, and it is still currently debatable, the respect towards the body of the individual does not cease to exist. And therefore, the body and the individual should be treated with dignity at all times. Moving into the codes of ethics, there is also currently a limited codes of ethics for the images of human remains. However, practitioners and experts are bound by the code of ethics put forth by professional organizations they have membership with. So as per the code of ethics developed by the British Association for Biological Anthropology and Osteoarchaeology, images of human remains should not be published without permission or consideration from the stakeholders, the institution, or the genealogical / cultural communities. Other organizations such as BABAO don't specifically state things like BABAO has. However, other codes of ethics, guidelines, and recommendations reiterate the same topic, where the wishes of the deceased individual's local community, relative, or guardian should be granted where possible, and informed consent and treated with respect and dignity all times. So some of these examples are the Department of Culture, Media, and Sport, the Scientific Working Group for Forensic Anthropology, and the World Archaeological Congress. Now to just take you into the humanitarian side of things as well, just for a little detour. In 2015, a series of photographs were, sorry, I've got the hiccups. In 2015, a series of photographs were taken of the body of 3-year-old Alan Kurdi on a beach near the Turkish town of Bodrum. The child had drowned alongside the majority of his immediate family as they tried to reach the Greek island of Kos after fleeing from Kobane, a Syrian town that had come under attack by the Islamic State. One image, which I'm pretty sure everyone is very well aware of, and I will not show the image. I'll only show this painting of the image. One image depicted the lifeless body in a red shirt, blue pants, face down and facing the direction of the ocean as the water met the shore. The photographs of Alan's body had limited indications of his death. It was removed from the broader context, and there was no clear evidence of decomposition. The clothing was intact, and he was in a natural position. So images like this are very popular in the humanitarian sector. Another example I can give you is following the Boxing Day tsunami that occurred in December 2004. The New York Times published a photograph of a mother and her dead children on their front page. So the photograph itself depicted the mother lying down crying while her dead children, while her very, very young and very, very small deceased children were lying across her chest and her body. The children themselves mimicked the photograph of Alan. There was limited indication of their death, and they could have been mistaken for sleeping. It is also quite common as well in the humanitarian sector to show the realities of what happens in post-conflict zones and areas, including remains that may not be recently deceased, and the remains themselves could be skeletonized as well. So images like these draw attention to the consequences of crises through a sympathetic and humanitarian lens. Obviously, this invokes a certain type of emotion from the viewer, and it limits the scope of visuals and understanding of the crisis itself. But it also can result in an increase of funding and donations towards organizations that work in the area where the photograph was taken. So I'm just going to go through now the types of audiovisual material or examples of audiovisual material that may contain human remains in the humanitarian sector. Obviously, this list is not exhaustive, and it may also apply in other sectors as well. So educational photographs, these are photographs of remains that can serve as an example and are valuable for developing the knowledge and capacity of students, practitioners, or even the general public. The next one would be images for publication or conference presentations. So these are quite similar as well. The material is taken and to disseminate to demonstrate a particular example, or in this case, the understanding of the publication or conference presentation benefits from the inclusion of the material. We also have promotional material where photographs and footage can be taken for the sole purpose of dissemination to the public through the material itself, or through publications and new reports. There's also material of training activities, events, and courses. So the training courses can be run for practitioners and experts to increase their knowledge, their skills, capacity, etc. Real human remains can be utilized in these activities to assist with the learning aspect of the course. There's also the inclusion of material within reports. So at the closure of any sort of casework, fieldwork, or assignments, all practitioners and experts are required to write a report to a certain extent to disclose the activities. This often includes photographs of the landscapes, the activities, which may or may not include human remains. We also have the additional casework photographs or case photographs, so any additional photographs or material taken during casework, fieldwork, or assignments. There's also the possibility of the photographs for identification. So photographs of human remains are taken to assist the authorities with the identification. These photographs can include the whole face, the whole body, the upper body, the lower body, and any identifiable features, which can include trauma, pathology, or body modifications. These photographs are relevant to the identification process and can include personal effects, and is most common in disaster victim identification situations. And finally, we have the materials from repatriation events. So images and footage can be captured of repatriation events where the remains of identified individuals are returned to the families or the community. This can also include the images of human remains alongside or within the same image as their name or their coffins, or the images of the deceased before they died, as the entire event can be recorded and disseminated to the public. It's really interesting to note here that in 1991, the US government instituted a ban against photographing flag-draped coffins returning from the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Although the ban only affected pictures of the American soldiers' coffins, the official justification for the ban was to protect the privacy of the deceased loved ones, and reduce the hardship on the families and the friends of the deceased. The ban was then lifted in 2009 by the Obama administration. So now that we have these different examples of the types of material, we've also put in how to mitigate the dissemination of this material containing human remains in the public sphere. So for educational purposes, the remains that have provided consent could be published publicly. And if not, the illustrations of examples should be opted for whenever possible. And trigger warnings should be applied and presented every time there's an inclusion of human remains. And the same goes for the publication and conference presentations. Extremely similar guidelines. Promotional material, we believe it is unnecessary to include human remains in promotional material. There are many different types of images or videos that can demonstrate the functional capacity of forensic practice without the inclusion of human remains. Promotional material containing or depicting human remains should include disclaimers that informed consent was received by the next of kin or community for the image if it is selected for promotional material. Material of training activities, seeing that not all training activities involve human remains, activities that do require human remains don't necessarily have the added benefit of visual documentation of the students going through the training course. So the inclusion of photographs within reports, in most cases with the exception of deploying to disaster events, it could be deemed unnecessary to include material of human remains. And it could be, where it's exceptional to include the remains, it would suggest that reports have appropriate warnings of graphic material and trigger warnings in regards to the photographs being included. When it comes to the additional photographs taken for casework, fieldwork, or assignments that are not included in reports, this is essentially unnecessary to share and disseminate in the public space. Photographs of possible identification. So these photographs may be disseminated to the public by the authorities with jurisdiction in a managed way to assist with the identification or the identification of missing persons. The decision for dissemination should be determined by the authorities. And materials from repatriation events. So the material of the event is deemed necessary to demonstrate the work. However, there is no need for the material that is disseminated to the public to contain human remains. Moving on to the general recommendations that the ICRC has. So the forensic unit of the ICRC, we are sort of positioned as a reference when it comes to humanitarian forensics or humanitarian forensic action. And we would like to disseminate the key message that depicting human remains in audiovisual material should be avoided. So we would like to restrict as much as possible the external dissemination of audiovisual material depicting human remains. Informed consent should always be sought and provided by the next of kin with specific consent for the dissemination of material in the public domain. Alternatively, access to the material should be granted to the local communities, the relatives or the guardians of the deceased, and trigger warnings should be applied where possible. Thank you so much for all of my co-authors and everyone at the ICRC who's contributed to this little research project of mine, and thank you all for listening.